Okay, we're gonna get started here. This session is called Listening for Local Religion. All sessions are being recorded, so they'll be released later on. Our presenters are going to introduce themselves to you. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Please remember to keep your audio and video muted unless you're asked to unmute, since this is a meeting and not a webinar. Please use the chat as questions come to you or comments. Please put that in the chat and I will monitor that. And at the end, our presenters will be willing to answer some of your questions. And we'll do that at the end. So I'm going to hand it over to Isaac.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here with us this afternoon. My name is Isaac Weiner, and I am an associate professor of religious studies and comparative studies at Ohio State. And we're going to talk to you today about a project that I co-direct that we're excited to share with you. The audio collage that we began this presentation with consists of a number of different sound recordings that were all produced as part of this project called the American Religious Sounds Project. It's a collaborative research initiative co-directed by myself and a colleague of mine, Amy DeRogatis, who is a professor of religious studies at Michigan State University. Amy regrets that she could not be with us here today, but I'm delighted instead to be joined by other members of our team, Lauren Pond, who is our multimedia content producer based here in Columbus at OSU, Allison Furlong, our project coordinator, also based here in Columbus at OSU, and Vicki Brennan, who is a professor of religious studies at the University of Vermont, and the co-chair of our community engagement committee. Our other co-chair with Vicki, Eli Lyonblum, who is supposed to present with us today, unfortunately had a family emergency today and will not be with us either. So the American Religious Sounds Project, as you can see on this slide, takes as its central question, what does religion sound like in the United States, and more specifically in the Midwest, and especially Ohio and Michigan, where most of our research has concentrated. Allison, do you want to go to the next slide? Thanks. The project uses listening and audio recording as methods for documenting and reimagining the diversity of religious life in the United States. For the past 5 years, we have been training dozens of students and faculty at Ohio State, at Michigan State, and at other institutions around the country to produce high-quality audio field recordings, documenting the sounds of religion across a wide range of traditions and spaces, including some that might seem obviously religious and some that we think might seem far less obviously so. We've created a digital archive that now consists of hundreds and hundreds of recordings, the vast majority of them, as I said, produced here in Ohio or in Michigan. And we are in the process of transferring the archive to Michigan State, where the recordings will be ingested into the permanent collection of Michigan State's Vincent Voice Library for long-term preservation and public access. Over the last several years, we've also been working with a web development team based at Ohio State to build an interactive website that has enabled us to share our research with educators, scholars, and the general public. So in our presentation today, we're going to do a few things with you and then open it up for discussion. And we'd love your feedback and your response. I'm going to turn things over in a minute to my colleague Allison, who will offer a brief overview of our website. And then Lauren will talk some about our archive and the kinds of recordings we've gathered over the last few years. And we'll have the chance to listen to some examples. I'm going to then talk a little bit about how the COVID pandemic over the last 6 months has disrupted and transformed our research. And then finally, Vicki will discuss some of our upcoming initiatives and most excitingly for us, ways that we hope you can get involved and join us in our work. So again, thank you for being with us today. And I'm going to hand things over now to Allison.
Thank you so much. As Isaac mentioned, I am the project coordinator for the American Religious Sounds Project. And one of my jobs has been to work closely with the application development team at OSU on our website. I've included the URL here, but also, actually, if I can switch screens for a moment, I wanted to give you a bit of a walkthrough of what the website looks like when you actually experience it. So can you all see, it should be a map of Columbus. Is that what people are seeing right now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I decided I wanted to focus on the Columbus map, since again, this is where a lot of our work is centered. When you go to the website, you can see a map, and each of these dots represents a site where we've done research. In some sites, for instance, this is the Ohio Expo Center. You can see we've made a great many different recordings at different events at the Expo Center. At other sites, we've maybe uploaded only a single recording. So for instance, if we click on this here, and it is loading now. But we are, I think my internet may be preventing it all from loading quite so quickly. This is a recording that we have made of a Dashain festival held at the Bhutanese Nepali Hindu temple in Columbus. And if you will hold for a moment, I'm going to try reloading this and see if I can get it to actually display everything. Okay, so coming back to the map. So there we go. And so for each item in our archive, we include, when possible, photos. Many of these photos were taken actually by Lauren Pond, who you'll hear from in a moment. It includes audio of the event, and also various keywords associated with the recording. So for instance, in this case, we indicate that it's a Hindu
Allison,
tradition.
I'm sorry, do you want to pause the audio? It's a little hard to hear you over the audio.
Oh, sorry, sure. In this case, we indicate the languages spoken, the types of audio you're hearing, the types of sounds you're hearing, what type of space it is, which of our research teams, in this case Ohio State, did the recording, when it took place, including the season, the day of the week, and the time of day. But one of the things that is particularly nifty about the way that this has been set up, you can also look at connections between types of religions in terms of their sound. So for instance, let me just move this out of my way. That was a Hindu ceremony, and you can see here the blue dot is the ceremony we were just listening to. We can pull this out and see that there are other Hindu ceremonies in the archive. So for instance, in this case, we could change over and decide we wanted to listen to the sound of the Diwali festival in Powell in 2015. And finally, I'd mentioned those sort of keywords that you can see in the details. You can also use those to filter through all of this material. So for instance, say I wanted to see all of the Hindu events. I could open this filter bar, select Hindu, and you can see that these are all of the Hindu events. If I wanted to then see all of the Hindu festivals, we have festivals actually listed under sound types, but also say festivals with bells. We can see that. If we wanted to see all of the festivals that take place in autumn, you can do that. If you then decide you want to see, instead of festivals in autumn, I want to see festivals in the spring, you can change those filters. And if you then decide, maybe I don't want to see only the Hindu festivals, maybe I want to see all kinds of festivals that are taking place in spring, you can, again, get to any of these. So from here, we could say, look at the African American Heritage Festival that took place at the Ohio Union in 2016. So the short version is that this is a fairly delightful rabbit hole of sounds and religious practices that is just fun to explore, but it can also be incredibly useful if you're teaching, if you're talking to students about either religion or sound, that this can be a good lens for how to approach either of those two subjects through the lens of the other. And now I will go back to presentation mode and move on to the next slide.
So, my name is Lauren Pond. I'm the multimedia producer for the American Religious Sounds Project, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the materials that we have in our archive, which Allison was just showing you. So our recordings are both the product of one-time visits to communities and more sustained relationships with these communities. In gathering materials, we focus on both breadth and depth, documenting both the wide range of religious traditions in this region, but also returning to certain communities and recording multiple facets of their practices and activities. Among other communities in Columbus alone, we've recorded Bhutanese Nepali Hindus, which we just heard a clip of a few minutes ago, Ethiopian and Serbian Orthodox Christians, a Wiccan coven, and practitioners of a tradition known as Ekankar. The recordings also contain a lot of different kinds of sounds. I think when we often think about religious sound, we may think of the so-called main event or a formal worship ritual, or things like music and choirs, which our archive does capture these important sounds, but we also try to capture instances where religion spills outside of these sort of expected categories into sort of informal community activities, the public sphere, daily life, and the home. We've recorded things like preparations for a Lenten fish dinner in a church basement, an outdoor food pantry held by Muslim youth, a singing bowl circle in an outdoor park, and the brewing of sacred mead in a pagan household. So our recordings ask listeners to consider what sound tells us about religious communities and practices, as well as sometimes reconsider what we might count as religious to begin with. So to date, our recordings have largely been been produced by student researchers and ARSP staff using mostly Zoom H4n recorders, these portable professional recorders. But as outsiders to most of the communities we document, we also recognize the limitations and ethical considerations of our practices, and we're eager to engage more with communities who would be willing to document their own practices, to share their knowledge and perspective as members of these traditions and contribute these materials to our archive, which I believe Isaac is going to touch on a little bit here. And Allison, if you want to go to the next slide, I will talk about a couple of the examples from our archive. The first is from a protest at the Columbus airport against the first travel ban that was issued in 2017, which was targeting Muslim majority countries. Muslims and non-Muslims alike marched in this while chanting. And something we found particularly interesting was the acoustics and echoes produced by the architecture of the airport terminal, which created these kind of rolling waves of sound, and also this sort of fittingly, this sense of being trapped. It also sort of illustrates the increasingly common intersection of religion and politics in our everyday life here in the US. So I'll go ahead and play that one.
This is what democracy looks like. It's Muslim man has got to go. Hey, hey. The Muslim man has got to go. Hey, hey. This is what there's Muslim man has got to go. Hey, hey. This is what
And so moving on to the second example here, this second clip is from a service at a trucker chapel at a truck stop near Lodi, Ohio, which is a couple of hours north of Columbus. What's particularly interesting here, we think, is the hum of the truck engines you can hear just outside the chapel doors, which the chapel itself is located inside of a semi-tractor trailer. Evangelical ministries, like the one that hosts this chapel called Transport for Christ, aim to meet people where they are in environments that are familiar to them and tailor their message specifically to this population's needs.
So that's the other side of what he was bringing to the Colossians. He wanted to warn them about the bad stuff, but he wanted them to know that it is so important that we put on compassionate hearts. It's so important that there's kindness in our life, that there's humility in our life, that there's meekness and patience. And overall, that we love one another. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. 2. 'Twas grace that Dear Heavenly Father, right now, Lavina has an issue with her neck. That did not come from you. That came from the devil himself, and we're not accepting that. So now we just ask that you pulled out right now in the name of Jesus. Any of that pain, any of that tightness, let it just be gone in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. The hour I first believed, through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far. Grace will lead me home.
And this last clip is from Ethiopian Orthodox Church in St. Louis, Missouri, which is really closely tied to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church here in Columbus, which we've built a relationship with as well. And what you're about to hear is music during a Sunday liturgy service. And particularly important are the ways it incorporates traditional East African drums in Ethiopian languages, Amharic and Ge'ez. Christian Orthodoxy often has these cultural and national ties, and community members have told me how this tradition provides stability and cultural continuity for them in the diaspora.
So as with everything else in our world, our research was pretty profoundly disrupted about 6 months ago. And we wanted to take a little bit of time today also to talk about some of the ways we've adapted to the changing world in which we all live, given the COVID pandemic. Last spring, we were in the midst of running a couple of pilot projects with colleagues at other universities who were integrating our project into their courses, working with students to document sounds of their local religious communities in the context where they worked and taught and studied and lived. And those projects were, of course, put on hold when we could no longer visit or do in-person fieldwork or visit sites in person. And many of the communities with whom we had partnered over the last several years to document their religious practices, we realized that we could, of course, no longer visit them in person. But just as they were adapting their own religious practices to the new environment, we would have to rethink and adapt our own methods as well. For the first several years of this project, we had relied on a kind of a very strict set of protocols in terms of the kind of training and the kind of methods that people went out and did gathering for our project. And that was grounded in ethical concerns, in various technological concerns in terms of the quality of the recordings we were producing, and other kinds, and intellectual commitments of ours as well. But in this time when we were all separated by the COVID pandemic, we decided it was a good opportunity to experiment with crowdsourcing as a method for gathering recordings. And we put out a public call last spring over the course of March, April, May, and June primarily, to invite people from around the country to contribute recordings to our archive documenting the ways that their religious practices were changing and were being transformed as a result of the COVID pandemic. We got wonderful submissions, over around 150 recordings or so we've collected to date, and we're hoping to collect more, which is also, we'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes. But it's really kind of a remarkable collection of recordings we've gathered that have allowed us to begin to track in real time the way that religious practice and religious community are being transformed as a result of the pandemic. So we've heard religious rituals, of course, move online, and the way that live streaming and Zooming have transformed the sounds and the practices of religious communities. We've heard examples of what we might call religious tourism, people no longer being confined by the sense of local geography, but visiting shrines and cathedrals and pilgrimage sites and other religious institutions all over the world that they haven't had a chance to visit physically or in person. We've heard new rituals being created and developed, which we'll have an example of in a moment, specifically within the context of the COVID pandemic. We've heard shifts in authority, and I'll give an example of this in a moment too, of the way that Zoom and live streaming and technology, or who has access to be able to get to places in person and who doesn't, have shifted what it means to have authority within a religious community and the authority that's exercised within particular religious rituals. We've also heard real interesting shifts related to inclusion and access when it comes to religious community and religious ritual. So on the one hand, the pandemic, of course, has shut off certain forms of access that people might not be able to gather physically in person in the same ways. But we've also heard examples of the ways that the pandemic has opened up new opportunities for inclusion within religious communities. So for example, one poignant submission we received was from a mother a mother of a child, child nonverbal with autism. And the recording captured her family sitting in their living room, listening to a live stream recording of a church service, and the mother is administering the communion herself to her children, and her nonverbal child is making all sorts of various kinds of utterances and sounds in the background. And the mother submitted this recording to us and told us that she's never really felt comfortable bringing this child into the physical space of the church, but by the new opportunities through kind of live streaming the service into their home allowed their child to be included in new ways. So really interested in the ways that the pandemic has both constrained access and also opened up new opportunities for inclusion into religious community. And all of this is helping us chart in real times the ways that, as we understand it, the pandemic is not disrupting or undermining necessarily religious community, but is instead inspiring religious communities to be highly creative and innovative in reimagining what community is and what community means. And we're really excited to have this opportunity, as I said, in real time to document these changes and produce an archive that we hope will be useful in the future for reflecting back on what the lasting impacts and effects of the COVID pandemic might be when it comes to religious life in Ohio, in the Midwest, and in the US. Allison, if you could, yeah. So I just want to offer a few examples, concrete examples of some of the themes that I just touched on. The first is a ritual called the Cone of Power. And what was great about this one is we had the opportunity, Lauren produced these recordings, had the opportunity to compare the same ritual as it was performed pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. It was a ritual Lauren had recorded live prior to the pandemic, and then revisited the same community to see how it had changed. So the Cone of Power is a Wiccan practice that is performed to raise energy for magical purposes, usually through chanting. And as you see in the image here, it usually involves participants standing in a circle, linking hands, forming the base of an invisible cone to the top of which energy is believed to flow. And let's listen to what it sounded like when recorded in person in someone's living room a couple of years ago.
The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot.
So it's a very powerful ritual that involves a co-presence of bodies and an intricate interweaving of voices. After everything shut down last spring, the community gathered via Zoom to try to recreate this ritual over the Zoom. And given what we all know about the audio delay on Zoom, you can imagine how that went. But Lauren participated with them and tried to record what happened and was able to produce this recording for us.
You guys ready? Okay, so just as a practice, seasons change, but the magic still remains.
Seasons change, but the magic still remains. Seasons change, but the magic still remains. Seasons change, but the magic still remains. Seasons alive and the magic is afoot.
The goddess is alive and the magic is afoot.
I don't know if this is going to work.
And the magic is afoot. The goddess is alive. Are you guys ready?
Yeah. Uh-oh.
Brian.
There's too much for the bandwidth.
Okay, so you're not getting it in real time then. So, yeah, hit your
Yeah, it's not going to work.
Yeah, we should just hit the mute button.
Why don't we watch you guys do?
Yeah, we should mute and you can pin yourself because it keeps going with everybody.
But seriously, I do want you to have the experience of doing this there. If I get this right, you should film me reaching out to each and every one of you while we're doing this.
Which is actually the goal. I want you to have the experience of being with that. Okay? Anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started.
So you can hear the way this community tries to preserve some sense of continuity of the ritual even during this time. And yet, of course, it also changes dramatically as it goes from a ritual really of communal co-presence to one where everybody has to mute, right, except for a single leader. Our second example was contributed to us by a hospital chaplain from Illinois who took a classic, an ancient Christian practice of the ritual washing of the feet on Maundy Thursday in remembrance of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. And in the spirit or in the time of COVID, she talks about the way that she converts it to a ritual washing of the hands instead.
Hi, I'm Megan Pike. I'm one of your staff chaplains here at Blessing. And this Maundy Thursday is different than any other Maundy Thursday we've ever had. And we wanted to be able to bring you a blessing on this day, to be able to remember the season of the Holy Week and provide you with an opportunity just to pause, reflect, and take this time to think about the work that you're doing for our staff, our patients, our community. And so much like what's usually offered on Maundy Thursday, a washing of the feet, we want to offer the idea of a blessing of the hands, hand washing. And so this is something that you could do in remembrance of what Jesus did in serving his disciples, the ultimate symbol of service, right? And so we want to offer the idea of you spending that 20 seconds washing your hands as a blessing of your own hands for the work that you do here each and every day. So I invite you just to pause with me as I share this blessing. Blessed are the works of your hands, hands that bring healing, hands that offer comfort and support. May the sacredness of your work bring hope and renewal to those you work with, as well as to those who receive your work. Thank you for the loving care you give to patients, families, and staff. May our Creator renew your spirit and bless you today. Amen.
So if the first example of the cone of power, right, is about the difficulty of simply continuing rituals as they were before, the Maundy Thursday example gives us, right, creative reinvention and creative reimagining of rituals in a way that specifically sanctifies the practice of public health in this moment. The third example, which is probably my favorite, was a viral tweet that was submitted to our archive that features an Orthodox Jewish man who in the tweet, he asks his followers, are you missing the sounds of Torah chanting? Torah chanting is a practice that traditionally in Orthodox communities can only be done within the presence of a minyan of 10 Jewish adult men who could not physically gather during the time of the shutdown last spring. And he put out a recording of himself chanting to the tune of Torah chanting, except instead of chanting the Torah, he chants the children's book, Goodnight Moon, as you'll hear in a moment. And why I love it so much is because it speaks to the feeling that many of us, I'm a parent of small children, have experienced over the last 6 months of the constant intertwining of all aspects of our life, so that our child rearing and the constant relentless focus on children in the domestic sphere spilling over into all other aspects of our lives.
Amen. In the great green room, there was a telephone and a red balloon and a picture of the cow jumping over the moon. And there were 3 little bears sitting on chairs and 2 little kittens and a pair of mittens and a little toy house and a young mouse and a comb and a brush and a bowl full of mush and a quiet old lady who was whispering, hush, good night room, good night moon, good night cow, jumping over the moon, good night light in the red balloon, good night bears, good night chairs, good night kittens and good night mittens. Good night clocks and good night socks, good night little house and good night mouse, good night comb and good night brush, good night nobody, good night mush, and good night to the old lady whispering hush, good night stars, good night air, good night noises everywhere.
So it's such a great example, right? Because it shows both the centrality of the domestic space during this time, but also how through sound, people try to reconnect to communities and houses of worship that they can't necessarily physically attend during the time of shutdown, the lockdown last spring. Yeah, we'll go to the next slide. So as we said, this was our first kind of venture into crowdsourcing our collection. And so far, we think it's been more successful than we had dreaded or feared. And we really hope part of our goal in sharing these with you today is to inspire your own thinking about the ways that you might reach out to or partner with the communities who you work with in your local contexts and invite them into this work with us of how they might, the people you partner with and work with and the work that you do might further contribute to our archive of, as we said, trying to document in this time in real time how the COVID pandemic is changing the way people experience religion and spirituality.
Hi, everybody. I'm Vicki Brennan. I'm hoping you all can hear me. Yes. So I'm Vicki Brennan coming to you from Vermont, pretty far from Ohio, but I'm very excited to be part of this project. I am, as Isaac introduced me, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Community Engagement Committee. And so one of the things the Community Engagement Committee is interested in is getting more people outside of the university context in which the ARSP has worked involved. So there's a few ways, in addition to the COVID project that Isaac just talked about, we're also interested in getting educators at secondary or even younger levels involved. One of the best, easiest ways we think is to use the website in teaching. And there is a section on the website that is devoted to teaching with tips on exercises that can be used in the classroom. We're also happy to have teachers who use the ARSP in their classroom connect with us to tell us how you have used it or how you want to use it in your pedagogy. We're also interested in connecting more with religious institutions in local communities, trying to help them learn how to document their own practices. And this could be a really great way for religious schools who work with young people to get them to learn more about their tradition and connections between traditions through the website, but also to recognize the importance of documenting religious practice for the purposes of continuity and transmission and all that kind of stuff. And then finally, we think that people might be interested to hear more about what is happening in their communities, both in terms of sound as well as in terms of religion. So especially for those in Columbus and nearby cities, the website and the sound map that Allison showed us earlier is a really good way to get started to explore some of the sounds, religions, festivals, to think critically about where you can hear religion in your community and what it's doing in those spaces. So we hope that you'll get involved. I'm going to talk just briefly about two public-facing kinds of programs that we're working on. So Allison, if you can move to the next slide. The first is we're working on a couple of exhibits using materials in the archives. The first exhibit is an immersive installation that'll be at the Ohio State University Urban Arts Space in Columbus. This installation is going to feature a variety of spaces in which religious sounds are made. We're going to talk about, we're going to present sounds from religious institutions to the sounds that people make in their private homes concerning their religious practice. We're going to look at religion in the streets and in other public spaces, especially the Expo Center, to religion in outdoor spaces or natural spaces. We are creating sort of loops of recordings particular to those spaces that allow different aspects of experience and practice to emerge. And we're going to play just a little loop example of one of the loops. Is the outdoor space loop. So Elson, yeah, why don't we play that?
Down from the heavens, the waters flow to this place, brightened by the sun, warmed by the cosmic rays. Shining ones, give us the waters.
Shining ones, give us the waters.
From the waters below that well up from the earth. Fount of wisdom, the spring of renewal. Drawn up here, cut away, filled for us. Shining ones, give us the waters.
Shining ones, give us the waters.
From the far reaches of the land, from the far edges, where the sky is upheld, drawn here, flowing over the land, reaching this space. Shining ones, give us the waters.
Shining ones, give us the waters.
Children of earth, behold the waters of life.
Behold the waters of life.
Okay, so that loop does a really good job of pointing to how members of religious congregations or groups make use of outdoor spaces and natural sounds in a variety of ways, from using the acoustics of outdoor spaces to enhance a particular kind of experience, such as singing or playing drums in a cave, to the incorporation of natural sounds themselves, such as water or bird song, as part of their religious practice. The exhibition at the Urban Art Space is scheduled to take place this in spring of 2021 or summer, spring 2021, though that schedule may change just as everything may change under these pandemic circumstances. But we'll, you know, if you keep checking in with the website, you'll have the latest information. The other exhibit we're planning is through the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service. And this will be a traveling poster exhibition that, once it's ready, will be made available to museums, libraries, science centers, historical societies, community centers, schools, any number of local institutions to display. It will feature 15 posters as well as sounds coming from the archive that bring out some of the aspects of how we understand religion differently when we pay attention to sound. Can we move to the next slide, Allison? The other thing that we're doing beyond these exhibits is we're trying to develop ways in which we can get greater participation from communities by contributing to the archive. So we're developing handbook for partner institutions that we'd like to expand so that other institutions might be able to use it to contribute their sounds, the sounds of their religious communities, to our archive. And we hope that this handbook, if it's shared widely, could be used to expand and to support educational institutions, other sorts of institutions to contribute. To go along with the handbook, we're going to develop a podcast that will take people through the techniques and ethical considerations that are necessary for creating and producing recordings that to be included in the archive. And we're hoping that between the two of them, this will allow the archive itself to expand beyond those parameters. I think we're ready to move to discussion if anyone, but yeah, unless anyone wanted to make other concluding remarks.
No, I think with time we should open up if there are questions or discussion. We're mostly interested in hearing about how we can best partner with you all and in the local context and communities you work with to encourage people to work with us and the materials we've gathered and also contribute to helping us gather more.
There was one
we're happy to field
question.
whatever questions you have, as well as we can pose questions of our own to you.
Yeah.
There was one question in the chat, and this was while Allison was sharing. Emily wanted to know how the connections were generated.
Sure, I'm happy to talk a little about that. There are a number of different factors. The model that our programmer used when he was building it was actually sort of a gravitational model. So the primary links tend to be between groups of the same religious background, but there are also then will be stronger connections depending on the types of spaces used or those other keywords, those other filter items. So types of space used, types of sounds, but the primary method of linking is through the religious tradition. Does that answer your question?
I'll say no. So for over the course of, I'll just add to that. For over the course of the number of years doing the project, we as a team kind of gradually developed a custom set of metadata that we use to tag the recordings, and each recording is tagged by us through basically a consultative process through our conversations with the communities who we've recorded in partnership with them, and also amongst ourselves, that the tags themselves are not computer generated, but are generated through our interpretive work as scholars of making sense of the recordings we've produced.
Right. Yeah, we have kept those as a controlled vocabulary.
But yes, computer generated from the keywords that we've applied to each recording, I should say.
So we were hoping to have a sort of open discussion about our questions, but given the time, we can do this, or we could answer your questions specifically. I think our questions concerned, what sounds are in your community. How might members of your community want to partner with us? And then, how can we help share more information about the ARSP?
There's a question in the chat from Kyle. He was hoping you might be able to shed some light on his question. He's wanting help to catalog and record the experiences and traditions of a local Islamic group. Are there any suggestions you have on how to best approach them?
Lauren, do you want to talk a little bit about how you've reached out to some of the communities you've worked with?
Sure. We usually, as part of the project, we have sort of a script that we use when we contact folks for the first time, just telling a little bit about what we're interested in doing and recording. And so as a photographer, as a recordist, I usually just sort of reach out to people at first and see if they'd let me sort of attend and get to know them a little bit, and before I start any sort of documentation. So you might see if you could just go and visit the community and then gradually sort of talk to them about any sort of documentation you might want to do, and see what their concerns are, any questions they might have, so forth. Isaac, I don't want to add to that.
Well, I would just add, sorry, I'm not Isaac, but it might not fit with your time frame, but we are hoping to develop these materials that then would would provide these kinds of guidelines, including the script, as well as some of the technical specifications. But Lauren's advice is just that's the best, baseline place to start, which is to, before you start any recording or asking questions, just ask if it's okay that you come and you visit and you observe for a little bit. That would be my advice too.
A lot of what we've done too, and we've had the benefit of working with Ohio State University students, many of whom are from all parts of Ohio and different backgrounds, traditions themselves, is often drawing on the connections and backgrounds of the students themselves, who each have connections with different kinds of communities that we've been able to draw on as well.
Andy apologizes for jumping in late, but really wants to know the philosophy behind it. Why record religious sound?
Isaac, I think.
Do I have to start with this one? It's a great question, and we have the first thing I'll say. This is not as much of a cop-out as it sounds like, although it's a bit of a cop-out. Is on the website we have a series of kind of FAQs where we try to address some of the intellectual underpinnings of the project, as well as methodological and theoretical questions for those who really are kind of interested in a deeper dive there. We invite you to spend time with some of the documents and kind of programmatic statements we have on the website. There's a number of answers to that question for us. I think one is that sound for us, sound has been a really useful way for us to document and study religious practice in a way that first foregrounds religious practice and the experience of it kind of as an embodied ritual and practice, and not merely as something that is internal, about kind of internal or private personal beliefs. When we foreground sound, it's something that is very public and communal and social in ways that we've really tried to draw attention to. It's also allowed us to really foreground the ways that religion is not something narrowly confined to particular places or times. It's not just 11 a.m. on Sunday morning in church, but documenting through sound has allowed us to show all of the ways that religion is intimately entwined with other aspects of social life and everyday life. And you hear on some of the recordings we played today, the ways that kind of the sounds of religion have been integrated with what we might call the secular sounds of everyday life. That has been really kind of interesting and provocative for us, as well as calling attention to the ways that religious practice, right, spills outside of all these kinds of boundaries. The last thing I'll say for now, and I could say much more, is that we are really interested in sound as a medium of contact, that is, sound as a way that we as Americans come into contact with or encounter religious traditions, communities, and practices other than our own. So I first got into this project at a time when I was working on a book project that used sound as a way to get into debates and disputes about religion and public life in America. And I studied noise disputes about things like church bells and the Islamic call to prayer and public proselytizing. And I was really interested in the ways that when sound spills out into the public spaces of our lives, how it generates and mediates contact in ways that can bring about feelings of goodwill and harmony and pluralism and all those wonderful things, and also moments of real controversy and conflict and change over time that we have just found sound to be a really useful way of getting at some of those issues and questions. And I'm sure my colleagues would have other answers as well, but I'll go with those for today.
Laura asked an interesting question. She says, with the loss of communal church singing and music during the pandemic, do you find participants say they've lost a vital part of their faith practice?
Should I feel this one too? The short answer is yes, but I would say, right? Which is undeniably yes. And some of the recordings, the examples we give evidence of that, of the ways that something is clearly lost in the inability to gather together for communal song and communal worship in the ways that many of our recordings pre-pandemic document. At the same time, what we're really so fascinated by, and I tried to allude a little bit to, and we'll have other examples of this as well, are the ways that people are creatively and innovatively finding ways to recreate community, to recreate communal practice in ways that are not foreclosed or constrained by the pandemic. So the short answer is absolutely there's a sense of loss. And I think there's also a sense of opportunity that we are excited to document as things develop.
And Emily wanted to know how OSU and Michigan State collaborated for this project, or how they hooked up.
I guess I have to take that one too. So yeah, as I said, the project grew out of originally as I was working on this book project of mine, a book called Religion Out Loud that came out 5 or 6 years ago at this point. And I was doing, just as a classroom exercise, training students how to do this kind of field recording work without any ambition of a larger archival project like this, but really as an exercise to have students use their sensory perception to think differently about religion in their local communities, get them out of the university into their neighborhoods and their local contexts. And really it was a grant funding opportunity that came along that started getting me thinking bigger about this project. And it was a grant opportunity out of a consortium called Humanities Without Walls, which is a consortium of a number of Midwestern research universities that was trying to support interinstitutional, collaborative, public-facing humanities scholarship. So the only real stipulations of the grant were that it had to showcase the diversity of the Midwest in some ways, and it had to be interinstitutional. And I had gone to a session kind of brainstorming ideas, and a colleague of mine at Michigan State, Amy DeRogatis, my co-director, Amy kind of got wind of my idea, and she and I began a phone conversation that turned into an in-person meeting that turned into now 6 years of productive collaboration that our universities have supported as we kind of dreamed bigger and bigger and bigger about what this project might look like. But as I said, it grew out of this opportunity to collaborate that our institutions have been remarkably supportive of, and showing that, you know, as that's a joke, we may be rivals on the football field, but we can work together in the humanities.
Well, thank you all. We are out of time now. It is 3:30. So thank you everyone for your questions. This was a very fascinating project to hear about. Any final thoughts before we dismiss?
I want to encourage you, if you go to our website, there is a contact form where you can submit your name and email address, and we'd be happy to add you to our mailing list and keep you informed about the exhibitions that Vicki described, as well as updates and additions to the website, and inviting you into our work. There are opportunities and links there as well to learn how to contribute and partner with us on this project. And we're just grateful for your time and attention. Thank you so much.